All right, today we're going to dive into an absolutely epic story of conquest. We're talking hundreds of millions of years of survival, incredible innovation, and eventually total domination. But our conquerors, they aren't armies or empires. Nope, they're plants. And this is the story of how they took over the entire land.
So let's start with what seems like a really simple question, right? What makes a plant a plant? You're probably picturing something green, leafy, growing out of the ground. Seems obvious. But what if I told you that picture in your head, and even the scientific definition we use today, is not nearly as simple as you think?
That's right. A whole bunch of organisms that we used to lump in with plants, like fungi, and even some bacteria and protists, have been totally kicked out of the club. Yeah, the way we even think about the plant kingdom has changed dramatically. Even something called blue-green algae. Turns out it's not even considered algae anymore.
So before we can even get to how plants conquered the land, we first got to understand how we as scientists have figured out what a plant even is. It's a journey of constantly refining what we're looking at.
You know, way back in the day with Linnaeus, we used what's called an artificial system. Honestly, it was like organizing a library just by the color of the book covers. Simple, yeah, but you'd end up grouping completely unrelated plants together. Then we got a little smarter with the natural system, which looked at stuff on the inside too. That's more like organizing the library by genre, much better. But today, we use the phylogenetic system. This is the real deal. We're basically mapping out the entire plant family tree based on their DNA and who's related to who, evolutionarily speaking.
So where does this grand story of conquest begin? Well, it begins in the water. Long before anything could set foot on dry land, life was just thriving in the oceans, ponds, and streams. So let's meet our very first characters in this story, the algae.
And just look at this number, 50%. It is just staggering. Think about it for a second. At least half of all the carbon dioxide fixation on the entire planet, that's the process of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and making oxygen, is done by algae. I mean, they're basically a planetary-scale life support system just humming along quietly in the background.
So what are they really? Well, simply put, algae are these simple organisms that have chlorophyll. They're almost all aquatic, and as the main producers of energy-rich compounds, they are the absolute foundation of pretty much every single aquatic food cycle. Literally everything else in the water depends on them.
And their variety is just incredible. You know, you might hear algae and just picture some green pond scum, but they are so much more. On one end of the spectrum, you have these beautiful, tiny little colonial spheres like volvox. And on the complete other end, you have massive underwater kelp forests, with some plants growing up to 100 meters tall. It's an amazing range of diversity from such a seemingly simple group.
And it's not just about the ecosystem either. We use this stuff all the time, probably without even realizing it. You've got species like porphyra that are eaten all over the world. They make these things called hydrocolloids, like algin, that hold water and are used in tons of products. And agar, which comes from algae, is a key ingredient in ice cream and jellies. And get this, protein-rich chlorella is so good for you, it's used as a food supplement for astronauts in space. But of course, life couldn't just stay in the water forever. The land was this huge, open frontier, a vast, empty continent just waiting for its first residents. And a group of brave little pioneers, the Bryophytes, decided to make the first move.
And this nickname, Amphibians of the Plant Kingdom, is just perfect. It tells you everything you need to know. Bryophytes, like mosses and liverworts, were the first plants to actually live on soil. But just like an amphibian, they had one foot still stuck in the water. They could survive out in the air, sure, but they were completely dependent on having water around to reproduce.
And, you know, being a pioneer is always tough. Bryophytes had some serious issues. For starters, they had no true roots, stems, or leaves. This meant they couldn't grow tall at all. And since they needed that direct contact with water for their sperm to literally swim to the egg, they couldn't wander too far from damp, moist places. But, and this is so important, even with all those limitations, they were absolutely crucial. Together with lichens, these mosses were the very first living things to grow on bare rock. And slowly, inch by inch, they started breaking that rock down, creating the first thin layers of soil. They were literally laying the groundwork for every single complex plant that would come after them. Okay, so the next chapter in this story is a total game changer. It's an invention so profound, it would finally let plants cut the cord with the water's edge and really begin their conquest of the land. This was the vascular revolution. So, in come the Pteridophytes. You know them as ferns and horsetails. And they came with a revolutionary piece of tech,
vascular tissues called xylem and phloem. The best way to think about it is internal plumbing. For the very first time, a plant could suck water up from the soil with its roots and pipe it all the way up to its leaves. This let them grow tall and strong, far away from a constant puddle of water. And this new tech led to this kind of hidden but super important power shift in how plants live. See, in the mosses, that main leafy plant you see is the gametophyte, the part that makes reproductive cells. But in the ferns, the main leafy plant you see is now the sporophyte, the part that makes spores. This was a huge deal. By shifting the focus to a bigger, tougher, spore-producing body, plants were setting themselves up to grow way bigger and live much longer. It was a crucial step. Okay, so now our plants can grow tall. That's awesome. But there were still a couple of big problems to solve. And the solutions? Well, they were two absolutely brilliant inventions that would lead to total global domination.
First up was the seed, and the pioneers here were the gymnosperms. The name literally means naked seed, and the easiest way to picture this is to think of a pine cone. The little ovules, which become the seeds, are just sitting out there, not enclosed inside anything. This invention was a game changer because a seed is basically a self-contained little life support package for the embryo. It completely freed plants from needing water to fertilize.
And was this new tech successful? Oh yeah. The proof is right there in the forest. Gymnosperms include some of the most massive living things on the entire planet, like the absolutely majestic giant redwood tree, sequoia.
So what could possibly be better than the seed? Well, the answer is basically better packaging and better marketing. While the gymnosperms had those naked seeds just sitting on cones, a brand new group came along, the angiosperms. They made two critical upgrades. First, they enclosed their seeds inside a protective ovary, which then develops into a fruit, like this apple. And second, they invented the flower.
And this was the final checkmate. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, became the ultimate conquerors. Flowers allowed for super efficient, targeted reproduction, basically hiring insects and animals as pollen delivery services. And the fruits protected the seed while also bribing animals to eat them and, well, disperse the seeds far and wide. Their success is just undeniable. They range from the tiniest plant on Earth, Wolfia, to the massive 100-meter-tall eucalyptus trees.
So let's just take a second and recap this incredible 400-million-year journey, right? Life begins in the water with the algae. Then the bryophytes take those first scary steps onto land. The pteridophytes develop that internal plumbing to grow tall. Then the gymnosperms invent the self-contained seed. And finally, the angiosperms master reproduction with flowers and fruits, creating the green world we see all around us today.
I mean, from simple algae to complex orchids, it's just such an incredible story of innovation, with each group building on the success of the last. The flower was really the game-changing piece of technology that created our modern world. And in a new world, with a changing climate and all sorts of new pressures, it leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. What's going to be the next great leap for the plant kingdom?